On this episode, we cover the Joe Rogan Experience 2526 with guest JD Vance. No Rogan Experience starts right now. Welcome back to the show. This is a show where two podcasters now with 217 hours Rogan Experience get to know Joe Rogan. It's the show for those who are curious about Joe Rogan, his guests, and their claims, as well as for anyone who wants to understand Joe's ever-growing media influence. I'm Cecil Cicirello. That's Michael Marshall. Today, we're going to be covering Joe's July 2026 interview with Vice President of the United States, JD Vance. So, Marsh, how did Joe introduce JD in the show notes?
JD Vance is the Vice President of the United States, a Marine Corps veteran, former U.S. Senator for Ohio, and author. His latest book, Communion, Finding My Way Back to Faith, is available now.
Nice. Okay. Is there anything else we should know about?
Yeah, there is. This isn't the first time we've covered JD Vance, not even the first time we've covered an interview between Joe Rogan and JD Vance. So you know a lot about him right now, but there is a bit of context we should include because in June, the New York Times, they published a story about how the Trump admin actually held a meeting in the Situation Room to discuss how to handle the fallout of the Epstein files. And Vance was obviously in that meeting. And that story in the New York Times included this segment. The vice president appeared panicked to others in the room about the way the subject of Epstein was already dividing the MAGA coalition. Some senior officials had the impression that Vance bought into the darkest theories about Epstein and a cabal of predators hidden within the country's ruling class. Wiles would tell others that the vice president has proved himself to be a major conspiracy theorist. They'll actually reference in this interview that Vance is a conspiracy theorist. And this New York Times article explained that Vance was worried that voters who listened to Rogan might be parting from the Trump train over the Epstein stuff. And then the New York Times included this bit where Vance proposes that he should go on Rogan's show in order to push the idea that the Trump administration has been completely transparent over Epstein. Here's the quote for that. Vance had just gotten off the phone with Rogan, and he later told others that Rogan said he wouldn't have Todd Blanche on his show, but would take Vance. Vance argued that if he were the one to appear on Rogan's show, only a part of the conversation would be about Epstein. The rest of the interview, he told the group, would be about the president's recently passed legislation and what it would do for working families. And just over a month later, here's JD Vance on Rogan.
Okay. Well, what did they talk about on this episode?
They talked about the Epstein files, but that's only part of the conversation. The rest of the interview is about the president's recently passed legislation and what it would do for working families.
Interesting.
They also talk about how socialism is bad. That's actually going to be the main event segment for the show this week. And they talk about how the war in Iran isn't Trump's fault, how Israel are secretly pulling the strings of US politicians who've got divided loyalties. And hey, can anyone else hear a high-pitched whistling sound right now?
All right. Well, before we get to our main event, we want to say thank you to our Area 51 All Access Pass patrons. That's Gina Maloney, Chunky Cat in Chicago loves their Aunt Aoife, Scott Laird, Fred Argruthius, Laura Williams, no, not that one, the other one. The insanity with the names has to stop. Darlene, 3 seasons. This 4th one is Total Landscaping. Stone Banana, Morgan Gordon, Matthew Cutler, autistic Twitch streamer, twitch.tv/MTC_streams, Billionaire Oligarchs, Cindy Lynch, yes, that's Cindy Lynch, Dr. Andrew Gibson, online physics tutor. Hello, Christy. Yes, you, Christy. Hi, I'm talking to you. Can you hear me? Ramtam Tickler, Don't Thank Me, Your Show is Just Worth Investment, Carissa Gunderson, Lucy Cortez, I'm tired of arguing over which of us likes Eli the most. We just need to agree that he is our greatest best friend ever. Angie Matkey, Left Hand Voodoo, Megan Bray, and Stargazer97. They all subscribe to patreon.com/NoRogan. You could do that as well. All patrons get early access to ad-free episodes and a special patron-only bonus segment every single week. And this week, JD Vance tells us his theories on comedy. Check it out, patreon.com/NoRogan. But for now, our main event.
It's time
huge thank you to this week's veteran voice of the podcast. That was Chloe Showalter announcing our main event. Remember that you too can be on the show. Just send us a recording of you giving us your best rendition of It's Time. You can send that to noroganpod@gmail.com, as well as how you'd like to be credited on the show. I'm still asking because I'm not getting a lot of these guys. You gotta
We
help
do
us
need
out.
more.
You got to help us out here. Please send in your It's Times. If not, I'm going to figure out how to get my cat to do one. All right. Let's get started. This is, as Marsh said, the main event this show is going to be about socialism. The undercard later will be about voter ID. But the show goes for quite some time. They cover a ton of stuff. And we're picking up the show around 2 hours and 20 minutes in. They start talking. They shift off of a conversation off of steak and ice cream and come to this conversation about the Democratic Socialists of America.
There's nothing wrong with ice cream. Ice cream. Speaking of communists,
the Democratic Socialists of America.
Yeah.
That's actually what they do at their events is they throw the ice cream into the Boston Harbor instead of the tea.
yeah, those fucking people scare me. I'm really concerned that people think that's a good idea and that they think that socialism just hasn't been done correctly. That
Correct.
drives me nuts because I think a lot of like really well-intentioned, really kind and empathetic young people think that that's the way to go. And I do not think they understand the dangers of this ideology because it always leads to one thing. It leads to a very powerful military government that controls the population, period. End of discussion. And if you play it out, it is literally the only way they can get people to give up their money.
Yes.
It's the only way they can get them to give up their property. And when you're hearing like Mamdani talk about freezing rents and taking bad landlords and then confiscating their property, you're like, this is step one of what's happened in every communist dictatorship throughout history.
Yeah.
This is what happened in North Korea. Give the government the land and we'll make sure that no one ever has to worry about food. What a great idea.
Yeah, man.
Look how it turned out.
Okay, now this is obviously ridiculous, but I will point out at the start there, they make a joke about how the Democratic Socialists of America throw ice cream into Boston Harbor instead of tea. And I genuinely couldn't tell if that was meant to be a joke from Vance or just a straight out lie. I genuinely couldn't tell initially.
Yeah. And we started to look into this a little because it was actually annoying. You're like, what are you talking about? The DSA actually do ice cream socials. And initially we thought, well, maybe it's a reference to ice cream socials. But Marsh, you found something else.
Yeah, exactly. Because that can't be the ice cream socials thing because that's the opposite of his joke.
The
like, they're not saying ice cream is bad, they're eating the ice cream. What I did manage to find was an event in December where they threw ice into the Boston Harbor as a protest against tyranny, against the ice raids and things like that. So that's what they were doing in Boston. And I don't know whether Vance is kind of either referencing that as a joke knowingly or if he's kind of only half remembering that it was ice cream rather than ice or whether he's deliberate. I don't know, but it is weird. And I mention it because they'll mention ice cream multiple times throughout this and keep coming back as if the DSA have taken a stance against ice cream when they've done the opposite of that. It's so infuriating. So infuriating.
I want to just talk about what he's talking about with Mamdani. Obviously, Joe has a lot of problems. He says there's never been any socialist countries. I would argue that many of the countries, there's certainly countries in Europe that have adopted many socialist policies that work pretty well, but Joe seems to think that those things don't exist. But one of the things he's talking about is what Mamdani is doing in New York. And I just want to read part from an article because Joe says he's just going to seize property from bad landlords. That's essentially what he says. Here's what the article says. When landlords refuse to address a serious violation like heat or hot water outages, the city can step in and order repairs, then bill the owner directly. In the last 3 years, inspectors have ordered emergency repairs at 38 buildings that list either two different companies, right, as the owner. According to the records provided by the city's housing department, the men have been billed $400,000, essentially for almost $450,000 for those repairs. Mamdani has proposed using such fines as a vehicle to bring the distressed rental properties under city stewardship by aggressively pursuing liens on delinquent landlords and buying up their portfolios through foreclosure action. So he's using the existing laws we have to try to seize these properties of people who are essentially slumlords. This isn't him just walking in and sweeping up properties with no regard to the law. He's literally using the bankruptcy and lien laws we already use in most cities to stop exactly this.
Yeah, exactly. And it's so strange that Joe is like, his stance here is aggressively against doing anything to punish bad landlords. He's coming out in favor of bad landlords here because nobody is saying, Joe paints it as, well, it's equivalent of give the government the land and you won't have to worry about food. That's not what we're talking about. It's not like the government is taking your good farmland off you. They're saying that housing is a right. And if you as a landlord can't keep your property in a livable condition, you don't get to profit off being a landlord. You have a responsibility, if you own the property and rent it out to people, to make sure it's habitable. And if it isn't, people have got to live somewhere, so you don't get to be the one who makes a profit from renting this out. And the thing is, it's already like extremely expensive and wasteful from a government point of view in particular, to then have to pick up the pieces after a bad landlord when they've left the walls to go moldy, and then there are health repercussions and people end up getting sick and things, that the government is already who steps in and carries the can for that. They're saying, rather than us just keep being, Joe's all against waste, fraud and abuse, rather than doing the waste of having to pick up after bad landlords, we take the property off them because they've shown they haven't earned that responsibility. I think it's totally reasonable.
This next clip, J.D. Vance has thoughts on the ideas around the phrase, the means of production.
So I don't know who said this, but the whole argument of communism is that you seize the means of production, but because the means of production, the most powerful means of production is the human mind, you ultimately have to get into totalitarianism. You have to have control of that most fundamental element of the human person.
You also take away motivation.
Correct.
And there's a thing that people don't like, which is extreme wealth. But you have to understand that if it wasn't for the motivation of extreme wealth, you would not have an iPhone.
So
you wouldn't have these things.
Okay, so here's let me give you my my Christian answer to this. And
yeah, we'll let him give a Christian answer in a moment. But he says, I don't know who said this thing. Well, it's an incredibly stupid thing. So it doesn't matter who said this ludicrous thing that actually doesn't make sense. And this isn't the off-the-record part of the show. I won't just be sassy about this here. Let's actually analyze this. What they are going to do throughout this bit of the conversation is constantly conflate communism with socialism. Like these two things are interchangeable and indistinguishable from one another. And that isn't true. Communism, whatever you think about communism, it's all about collective ownership by the state. That is where the state will own the farmland and then will distribute the food to everybody. Socialism involves the state ownership of essential services and the provision of a strong social safety net, but it allows for private property and for personal wealth and even for the rewards of innovation, while what it really does is ensure that one monkey can't hoard all the bananas. That is essentially what socialism is doing. Yeah. That is what the democratic socialists of America are about. They're unsurprisingly socialist rather than communist. Kind of, I'd say the clue is in the name, but then again, Joe probably thinks that the Nazis were socialists because they had socialism. So okay, that's maybe reasonable. Joe is presenting this, and so is Vance, as a false dichotomy. In this particular case, this is Joe's false dichotomy. His argument is that you have to allow for one guy to own more money than an entire country while people are starving to death. Otherwise, you'll never get that slightly higher pixel count on your new phone. That is essentially the argument he's making. But here's a sensible third way. You don't need the incentive of extreme wealth, like Joe says. You could just have the incentive of reasonable wealth. Like a reasonable, well, let the company make the iPhone or the space rockets or the electric cars, but then you tax them on the profits from those things. And you do that as part of the social contract for essentially for access to their customers. They can't make money if they can't get access to the market to sell things to people. So if you want people to buy your things in order for you to make your large profits, the social contract is you have to give a certain percentage of that back, a profit back, to ensure that the people who are buying your products can also afford healthcare and rent and have clean running water. Because access to market is a privilege, not a right. And if you aren't capable of playing nice in the sandbox, you don't get to be in this market with us. That would be the socialist argument here. It doesn't require the false dichotomy of you either have extreme wealth or no iPhone. There's a middle ground to walk here.
One of the most frustrating things about this conversation, Marsh, is what you pointed out at the beginning here, which is they consistently conflate these two terms, socialism and communism. And it's throughout the entire thing. And they make it seem like we are one step away from a dictatorial regime of full-on 100% communism. And every step it's not that every step is going to lead us there. It's that we're just like a tiny bit away from it. We're like one step away from it. We are a hyper-capitalist society. We're not even close to that at all. We don't even have a recognizable social safety net. And it's interesting too, because Joe sometimes, on occasion, can sort of have these moments of clarity. Well, he'll mention, if there was an iPhone that was built here in the States and it had a stamp on it, I think he even says it in this very episode. If there was an iPhone that was built here, we would buy it over the one that's exploiting other people. And what Joe is missing is that the exploitation is the thing that creates the extreme wealth. So he's here touting and saying it's the innovation that creates the extreme wealth. It's really the exploitation that is creating that extreme wealth. That's what's creating that massive margin of money that they're able to gather. Did they have a good idea? Sure, they had a good idea, but that only goes so far if you're going to build it over here. They are exponentially creating more money by exploiting workers around the world. And that's something Joe seems to be against. So in some ways, I think Joe is more socialist than he wants to let on.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the reason he doesn't understand or accept that is because he has been persuaded that socialism is communism. Now, I think J.D. Vance knows there is a difference. And if he doesn't, he shouldn't be vice president of America. If he doesn't understand enough basic political theory to understand the difference between socialism and communism. Joe doesn't have that responsibility because he's not a politician. So I think he can be persuaded or be fooled into thinking that the two are intrinsically linked or are identical. And that will keep him away from the other socialist principles that we know he can actually show when he's talking to someone like Bernie Sanders.
This next clip, we're not cutting a lot of tape here. They're just start immediately talking about socialism and why socialism.
This is one of the things I talk about in the book is like there is a Christian idea of political economy that's actually been lost in American politics, where it's like we think of it as libertarianism, the hardcore free market, versus socialism or communism. And there actually is a third way that has existed in pretty much all Christian economic thinking going back 2,000 years ago, which is that, extreme wealth inequality does create problems, but you still got to have private property. You still have to have a state that protects private property rights. And there's a way to balance these things that I think we've sort of lost in our country a little bit. And when I like, okay, let me play devil's advocate with the DSA, because I think that their ideas are crazy. And I think that you're right. They will lead to a very totalitarian place. I'm not defending a single thing that they say, particularly their hatred of ice cream. What I am saying is, and maybe this is just sort of the way my mind works, I tend to be a little bit more empathetic. Why are young people attracted to socialism in 21st century America? One of the best interviews that Charlie Kirk ever gave, it was right before he died. It was an episode that he did with Tucker Carlson where he talked about the fact that if you don't give young people a stake, if you don't give them ownership, if you don't give them a sense of the American dream and of possibility in the future, they're going to become socialists. Like if you have a zero-sum environment for a 25-year-old in this country, they're going to start to say the only way for me to get anything is to take away from somebody else. So we have to get away from like the zero-sum thinking. I think that's like the root cause of this.
The way he tries to depict this is as if there's nothing bad about hyper-capitalist societies that we're in. They take things away and violate rights all the time. He just seems to think because this is a guy who's propped up by a billionaire in order to get his seat. I mean, this is a guy who's going to fight to the death for this ideal.
Yeah, and also, you're right that they take away rights all the time, but the question is, whose rights are they taking?
Yeah,
and in a hyper-capitalist society, they're not taking the rights away from the people that J.D. Vance very clearly values, because those are the people that he associates with and is paid by.
You're not wrong.
And what he's doing is a total straw man. The DSA aren't arguing against the concept of private property. they're essentially just arguing that one guy shouldn't get to own the moon. Like, we are talking about a vast gulf between those two positions. And again, right here, deliberately conflating socialism with communism because he finds it easier to argue against communism than socialist arguments. And then he presents the opposite of both of those. The solution to both socialism and communism is Christianity. Like, what a coincidence there that's what he says as he is here promoting his book about how he found Christianity.
I know we're not doing a toolbox this week, but I almost did Mott and Bailey with because they're so often in this conversation, they will take a stance that seems like, oh, well, you can't have dictatorial stuff and communism and all this. They're going to seize everything from you. And then they'll talk about socialism. And you're like, but those two things aren't the same. But you're using communism as the shield to protect you against, against all your thoughts about socialism. So it could have easily been the Mott and Bailey this week. It was just too disparate in order to put it together. We do this thing in this country too. He seems to be shitting on socialism a lot, but we don't bother to have a social safety net. What we do often is we'll wind up cutting our tax burden, but it's not our tax burden. It's not my tax burden. My taxes rarely go down. If they do, it's a tiny little bit. The tax burden that we always cut is on the ultra wealthy who have plenty of money to pay a lot more. Instead, we just keep on cutting any kind of tax burden their companies have, and then we pick up the slack. And it's like what they're doing is they're doing the exact opposite of socialism.
Yeah, completely that. And I think he's saying about what Charlie Kirk is doing when he's talking to Tucker, saying people are attracted to socialism. Why? Because they need a stake in this country, and they can't get a stake in this country. And I don't actually think that's wrong, but I think it's a little deceptive, because while we would agree that people are attracted to socialism because the hyper-capitalist society doesn't allow them to have a stake in society, we would probably disagree what a stake in society looks like, or what we mean by a stake in society to what Tucker and Charlie Kirk were talking about. Because I don't imagine Tucker Carlson, when talking about a stake in society, was talking about a living wage and access to healthcare. I strongly suspect it's more of a job not given to an immigrant and a wife not given to making her own decisions. I think that's the stake that those guys are talking about.
Right. At the end of this, he says, we have to get away from zero-sum thinking. And I do agree with J.D. Vance here. But the problem is that the Great Replacement Theory, which is a major point, a talking point, consistently on through most of Trump's policies, and in fact all around the world, it's happening in your country consistently, Marsh. The Great Replacement conspiracy theory is entirely zero-sum thinking. It's, if this immigrant wins, I lose. If this person of color wins, I lose. If they get something, I don't get it.
Yeah, exactly.
That's zero-sum thinking. You can't, J.D. Vance, stand in the middle of this room with a flamethrower and wonder why the house is burning down. This is literally the thing you've been talking about forever. So you can't shit on zero-sum thinking. That's the whole Republican ideal. Okay, next up, they're talking about how the game is rigged.
I think that unless you go down that pathway of allowing young Americans to own something, socialism is the inevitable outcome. Do I think that's good? No. But I really do worry, and I see this, frankly, more in my own party than I do on the other side. There is this revulsion to socialism that's totally justified without enough thinking about how did we get here in the first place.
Right.
And if we don't fix that, and I would say if we don't get back to a more Christian sort of understanding of economics, socialism is the alternative. Like that is where this goes.
Well,
if people don't
think
own
the
anything,
game is rigged.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And in some ways, Joe, the game is rigged.
Yes.
Yes. If you look at, again, I think so much of housing because, this happened, I think it was during the presidential campaign. Maybe it was right before. But I was talking to some family members over Thanksgiving and, just a sort of a younger friend of my wife's. They were like 5 or 6 years behind us. They were just about to get married. And this young woman, successful engineer, makes a higher salary than most Americans. She just sort of like tossed out there that, when her parents' generation was coming up, it was like possible to own a house and to raise a family and not be worried that much about things. And my thought was, okay, you're an engineer. You make way more money than 75% of people your age, maybe 90% of people your age. And you think that it is like this ridiculous, unachievable objective to have literally what your parents had, which is a decent job, a nice house, and a safe place. Does the socialism thing scare me? Yes. Is it the wrong solution? Yes. But one thing I try to persuade my fellow Republicans of is socialism is the alternative if we don't have a pathway to give people a sense that the system is not rigged and that the American dream is attainable. That's like our job. That's what we have to do. I'm not saying Rome was built in a day. It's not going to be easy to undo some of these economic trends.
What he's saying in this clip is, look, we juiced all the blood out of this rock, and and now we can perhaps think that it's possible for someone else, one other person, to own things. Yeah. That's what he's saying in this. It's appalling to hear him say this out loud. And this is such a bold statement coming from a Republican, because most of our economic theory since Reagan has been this trickle-down theory, which essentially is what he's talking about. He's saying all the money is concentrated at the top and none of it's trickling down. We thought it would, we planned for it to trickle down, and it just hasn't trickled down. Nobody has anything. Nobody gets to own anything. And he's standing there surprised by this.
Yeah, exactly. Like, that's the thing is, it's not that he is wrong about this. He's just not talking about how we got here. Like, the system is rigged. The thing they're talking about are problems, but they're problems caused by decades of your kind of policies. You know, it's bad that house prices. He talks about house prices being unaffordable. It's bad that those have risen so prohibitively. But what caused that? He's not talking about the need to buy, like the solutions here, the need to buy more, to build more affordable housing, or how inflation has been high for a long time, partly due to things like wars in Iran that's caused prices to go up, how income has been stagnating due to wages not keeping up with cost of living, how there's crippling medical debt, crippling student debt that are stopping people from being able to afford houses. These are the problems why people can't afford houses. And he can't talk about those things because they're caused by policies that he continues to support. And the solutions to all those problems are essentially policies he is on this show to demonize as being socialism. So all he can really offer instead is like, well, shucks, things sure are hard right now.
And he's standing there with his pockets turned out, just looking like, wow, it's really tough out there.
Yeah.
It's so interesting that he thinks that this can be fixed with Christianity. Why would you think that? Huh?
Yeah, exactly. Like, again, he's not just talking about socialism. He's talking about how socialism is communism, if you think about it. But now he's talking about how the opposite of that is a Christian economy. Just think about how much is smuggled into just that set of assumptions.
Yeah,
It's socialism is communism and the answer is Christianity is such a deeply rich idea to pick into to really understand what's kind of going on here. He's smuggling so much stuff into Joe's audience.
And I realize that this is really picking apart his words here. But he says in this, he says, give the people a sense that the system is not rigged. He's not talking about unrigging the system. He's talking about giving people the sense that the system is not rigged. I say that that's what you've been doing for a long time, and the system is rigged. So you need to unrig the system, not the other way around, not just giving people a sense. And it might be that he's just saying that, and that's just me being very nitpicky about how he said his words. But I do think that there is something to, like, we just need to tell people it's working and they'll believe us.
Yeah, I mean, that's what the whole, the tariffs will mean that you get a check for this amount of money. Like, those kinds of promises from Trump when he's bringing the tariffs in, that was there to give people a sense that the system wasn't rigged, that the system was, that they were coming in to unrig the system. It was never going to do anything for them. But all the conversation around tariffs was an attempt to give people a sense that the system was becoming unrigged.
An interesting turn here. They start talking about Wall Street.
But man, we ran the experiment. We ran the experiment of offshoring all of our industrial jobs, of becoming a services and finance economy, and allowing Wall Street to come in and buy every asset of modern life and turn it into an investable, line goes up asset. And what has that done? It's created a generation of kids who kind of are attracted to socialism. You have to fix that problem.
Well, with kids that do feel, and you're correct, and I agree with you, the system is rigged. kids feel like there are no options other than to burn it down.
Yes.
And that's the problem.
And
because they feel very frustrated.
And this is part of our job, is to provide an option that isn't burn it down, but is not just doing the same things that we've done for the past 40 years.
They're also terrified about the future because of AI.
So it's so frustrating to hear him talk about this, like how Wall Street came in and bought everything up and then tried to turn it into an investment just to make money. You were a venture capitalist. That is what you were doing, JD Vance. That was your whole fucking thing when you were given all that money and position by Peter Thiel. They are both talking about how the system is rigged. Moments ago, in a clip that we didn't play, it may come up in the gloves off segment, they were praising how smart Elon Musk is. The system is rigged, but Elon Musk is so smart. Even in this bit that we've heard so far, we've heard them say, you need extreme wealth disparity in order to inspire the creation of the iPhone.
Yeah.
Those are how the system got rigged. And you are praising them in this conversation.
Yes.
You know, neither Joe nor JD Vance have any interest or any intent in doing anything about the rigged system other than like tutting and then continuing to profit from it. Because bear in mind, Joe, I suspect he isn't a billionaire, but I suspect he's closer to that than being in the single digit millions. He's there because of a contract with a tech company that made its money by screwing artists out of royalties. That's how Spotify makes so much money, by playing music and not paying artists enough for it.
Yeah.
Vance, his role there, he was picked up and planted into his business and then his legal and his political careers by his billionaire sugar daddy, Peter Thiel, who made their money from the rigged system. Like, Vance and Rogan aren't solutions to the rigged system. They're symptoms of the rigged system and in part causes of the rigged system.
Great point. Next up, this is at the end of the last piece, they talk a little bit about AI. This is them talking about AI and unions.
I was talking to a CEO, not of an AI company, but of a tech company. And he's one of the few CEOs that's sort of right of center. And I was like, well, you know, what do you think? Do you think AI is going to come and take all the jobs? And his basic take was the real historical analogy is the Industrial Revolution. And, you know, did the Industrial Revolution displace or change a lot of jobs? Yes. It also created a lot of jobs that didn't exist before. So he was like, my concern here is not that 50% of Americans are going to be unable to find a job. There will be some displacement, some sort of churn in the labor market, but that's not the main issue. He said the main issue, if you go back to the Industrial Revolution, is that there was a lot of demand for workers, but the inequality in the country got completely out of whack. Like, this is the era of the robber barons. And then the robber barons in both Europe and in the United States led to fascism. It led to communism. Again, to this point about giving people an option. If you don't give them a good option, then it leads to fascism and communism. Now, there's this fascinating encyclical written by Pope Leo XIII. I'll send it to you. It's one of the best things that I think has ever been written by a Christian leader, where it's written in the late 19th century. And the basic argument of it is that in the age of industrial churn, there has to be a middle way between 6-year-olds working on the factory floor and socialism. And part of that solution is to give workers a sort of say in what's going on. Give normal people some power in this system.
I can't help but laugh at the beginning of this when he says, "Oh, there's a CI. Oh, I know, and he's right of center." It's a unicorn. Then it's only one.
Yeah, he says he's one of the few that's sort of right of center, which I can only assume is because the rest are far right. I don't know.
What a silly thing to say. Yeah. What he's talking about here, especially at the end with this genius encyclical written by a pope, is that basically what we need is unions, because there needs to be a better way than having 6-year-olds on the floor of a factory. Yeah, man. You know what fixed a lot of the problems in the United States and what gave us workers' rights in the United States, gave us a weekend, gave us a 40-hour work week, gave us overtime. It was all unions, man.
Yeah, exactly. I love the idea that JD Vance thinks that Joe Rogan is going to read a 19th century encyclical written by a pope. He's like, yeah, I'm going to go straight in that. Absolutely.
I think he'll listen to it in the sauna as well.
Yeah, exactly.
He'll get the audible version of the encyclical.
But yeah, the answer to this, he's saying it needs to be somewhere between 6-year-olds working on the factory floor and socialism. And he says the part is giving the workers a say in what's going on and normal people power in the system. The answer is representation and enfranchisement. But even in this interview, and we're going to cover it in the undercard, we hear J.D. Vance arguing against the kind of voter protection measures that ensure people have enfranchisement and representation. He's actively part of the efforts to restrict the normal people he's talking about, to restrict their representation and their power in the system. That is what they are doing to try and stop those people from being able to represent themselves. And then look, right now, okay, he's conflating socialism with communism again. And then he's saying that robber barons led to fascism and communism. Like fascism and communism are inherently linked. Mm-hmm. When I would argue that is not the case. That is not the only form of fascism, certainly isn't communism.
Yeah. There's a part of this too at the end, and he starts talking about these robber barons, and he's like, oh, it's a problem with the robber barons. We are literally in the digital ages version of this. Yeah. Look at how social media companies, just Facebook alone, they did unethical things left and right just to get money and make their investors rich and make their owners rich beyond belief. And that's just one. There's multiple companies in the digital age that have been absolutely unbelievably unethical and have gotten away with it and been rewarded.
Yeah, exactly that. Like, we are currently seeing that in large economies around the world, including the economy that J.D. Vance helps to run, we see billionaires, like the very people who put him into power, already acting as robber barons, using their wealth and their position in order to make the laws favorable to them and make sure that they can exploit as much as possible. And it is already leading to fascism. And
100%.
J.D. Vance is an example of both of those things.
Yes.
He genuinely is.
Absolutely. All right, so now they talk about wealth creation in an AI world.
And I think that's the thing we have to figure out with AI. I won't say that I have all the solutions because I haven't, but I think the fundamental question is, how do you ensure that normal people have some control over this? Control over what's their kids are seeing, control over, the economic forces that are being unleashed by AI, some certainty that they're not going to wake up in a world where they can't buy a home, but some other guy owns 35 mansions, right? That to me is the fundamental challenge of AI. Is it's going to unleash a lot of wealth creation, but if that wealth creation all goes to some segment of people, you're going to have communism. Like that is the choice before us. Is a lot of wealth being created. That's good, by the way. I like wealth being created, but if you don't ensure that there's some broader prosperity from that wealth creation, like we have run this experiment before, and it leads to communism.
Right.
What does he mean they're going to wake up in a world where they can't buy a home and some other guy owns 35 mansions? That's literally the system right now. What are you talking about? Of course they're going to wake up in that world because that's this world. That's right now, man. His boss is a billionaire. And I'm not talking, you could pick one, right? Because it could be Peter Thiel. It could be Donald Trump. Who knows who I'm referring to with his boss? Because they're both billionaires. They embody this entire ideal that he is decrying right now.
Yeah, exactly. And look, in this conversation, he is identifying genuine issues, but he's offering none of the solutions. And then the only measures that he does actually offer in this conversation are actively contrary to fixing those issues he's identifying. So I believe he wants to fix the economy, but only in the same sense that you might want to fix a horse race.
All right, next clip, more competition.
I think a second answer to the question is competition. So if you go back again to what worked and what was broken about the Industrial Revolution, hyper monopolist style companies that had way too much power. I mean, Teddy Roosevelt famously talked about how, some of the steel trusts were more powerful than the United States government. So you could vote. Your vote didn't matter as much because the corporations were more powerful than the government. I think reining that in, making sure that what's the most obvious way to give normal people participation? It's democracy. But if a single corporation has monopolized an entire space, then you don't have a real democracy unless you rein in the power of that company. And I think that is another big risk with AI. It's that we have a hyper monopolist who dominates the space and then influences the government, influences the nonprofit sector, and then real people are effectively cut out of the bargain. So
look, the way he seems to be talking about this as if this is a crazy thing, like these big companies are going to have so much of a say. This entire administration capitulates to every big company and every single rich CEO. All those people already have too much power, and they have so much influence over your administration, JD.
Yeah, exactly. Elon Musk has more power than political parties, to the point where he can decide to switch his support, as we talked about in the last episode. In the UK, switches his support from Reform to Restore Britain, and then cause a double-digit shift in the polls by doing so. That is the power he's got. Elon Musk can decide that Keir Starmer needs to resign and then train his entire propaganda engine onto making Keir Starmer more unpopular than Boris Johnson, to a point where people think he was demonstrably worse a prime minister than Johnson, which he clearly wasn't. We talked about it last week. Meanwhile, Facebook has so much power, they can barely be reined in by the whole of the European Union acting together. We are already at that point.
He says in this, we have a hyper monopolist who dominates the space and then influences the government, influences the nonprofit sector. Then real people are effectively cut out of the bargain. So is he talking about Mark Andreessen? Because he's someone who does all those things.
Yeah, the thing is, he's not even saying that happens now. He says that's the risk of it happening in the future.
Yeah, right.
But it is already happening now.
Yeah.
The only thing I can think is when he says influences the nonprofit sector. I wonder if he's he's nodding towards someone like George Soros, who they always say is trying to subvert democracy by funding all of these kind of nonprofits and stuff. But even if he was talking about that, I'd argue that Elon Musk effectively ending parts of the nonprofit sector that he doesn't like is already an influence on the nonprofit sector.
Very true. Also dominates space, huh? Right? Dominates space. That's Elon Musk. It's got to be. Look, here's the most important piece of this. He's talking about we need to handcuff these really, really rich people who are possibly these AI hyper monopolist billionaires who are going to try to dominate the government. We think that's already happening. But also, one of the things that the Republicans do consistently is tear down any regulation for all different types of things. And that's been happening my entire life, not just in one sector. It's all across the board. They tear regulations down. And now they're mad that a few rich people get too powerful because no one can stop them from their terrible and unethical business practices. You had every opportunity to do that for my entire lifetime, and you've not only refused to do that, you've decided to do the exact opposite and basically let them free reign of our economy. And now you're going to have to see you're going to have to reap what you sow. Okay, they talk about antitrust in this next clip.
Well, a friend of mine, his name's Orrin Cass, actually, very fascinating guy, sort of a right-of-center economic thinker. His idea is that 20th century labor law presupposes a sort of zero-sum conflict between the company and the union, and that where you've seen unions actually thrive, certain places in Europe, it's a little bit more cooperative. And the unions actually have a little bit more power themselves, where they can negotiate with the corporation with a little bit more breadth and a little bit more freedom. Whereas in the United States, we sort of set a floor. We create a very small number of things the union can actually negotiate over. And so a lot of people say, well, why would I join a union? Why would I participate in it? So basically making the union a little bit more cooperative, which requires changing the legal form of it. I think that's interesting. I think antitrust is a huge piece of the story. Now, it's a little early with AI because we don't yet know which companies are dominant. But I think one of the big mistakes, man, we made in the early 2000s is we should have gone after the big tech companies with antitrust. There is a trust-busting mechanism that exists in the U.S. government. We just didn't use it. We're going to have to be willing to use it in the 21st century.
Yeah, I mean, you can say that all you like, JD Vance, but if you even threatened to use any of those antitrust laws for even a moment, you'd have Zuckerberg and Mark Andreessen and Elon Musk on the phone to you in an instant. And if you didn't back down, which you almost certainly would, they would just take turns going on Joe Rogan to talk about the government tyranny until you did back down. Yeah. All of this, I think this is just talk. This is just his attempt to reframe himself as being a different politician to Trump. Because obviously you've got the midterms coming up and this is heading towards the end of Trump's term. It's well, JD Vance is different. He's not like Trump. That's what he's trying to do here. And this might as well be RFK Jr. talking about how bad the cost of living crisis is. Like, yeah, you can say that all you like, but when the chips are down, you're going to go for the thing that you care about the most, and it is not this stuff. And for Vance, it is not the antitrust stuff.
I just want to say Orrin Cass helped write Project 2025. So I don't know how right of center he is, if he's writing essentially a Christian nationalist handbook for our government. And he was thanked specifically for his contribution on Chapter 18, Department of Labor and Related Industries. So, pardon me, related agencies. I said industries, but, it's kind of the same thing, actually, when you think about it. All right. Next up, this is talking about unions. So that we talked about unions a little bit earlier, and they're bringing it back. They're rolling it back around.
And when it comes to unions, what is wrong with the current structure in terms of what power the unions have to negotiate for labor?
So there's a concrete example that Orrin uses all the time. So in some European countries, you have a minimum wage, right? In some European countries, the union can actually cut a deal with the employer to where you pay a brand new employee less than the minimum wage, then you pay a more senior person higher than the minimum wage. But in order to pay the junior employee less than the minimum wage, you have to provide them job training and better benefits and so forth. And so the idea is you turn for the first couple of years, you turn the company almost into an educational institution. But in order to do that, the union has to have flexibility. That kind of arrangement is effectively illegal in the United States of America. So it's that you create the ability for the union to be more flexible in how it negotiates. You don't set all the terms for it. You allow the union to figure out what's in the best interest of its membership.
Joe's asking here at the beginning what powers union have. The power is collective bargaining, and Republicans have been the leading edge of union busting my entire life. They have tried to destroy the American union, and so have the hyper-capitalists he seems to be decrying. They've been trying to destroy unions my entire life. He talks here. And also, too, the hyper-capitalists also try to bust unions. Look at Bezos, right?
Yes,
There's a perfect example of someone who has pushed against unions in his company forever. And he owns one of the biggest companies where most of the other companies that are in this sector, especially the shipping companies that are in the sector, they're all union. He's not, though. His company is not, and he's pushed against it the entire time. They talk in this about how these other countries, they have this minimum wage and they can go underneath it and they can provide job training, but we don't allow that because it's illegal to go against our minimum wage. Our minimum wage, our federal minimum wage in the United States is $7.25 an hour. Are we going to pay somebody $5 an hour so they can then, eat their own homework because they won't be able to eat any food with that kind of money, especially in the economy that you and Trump helped create?
Yeah, exactly. And when I first listened this through, I completely missed this point because I just didn't even compute how low your minimum wage is. So just for context, here in the UK, if you're over the age of 21, the minimum wage here is the equivalent of $17 an hour. If you're under 18, which is the lowest minimum wage that we have, and this is like legal minimum right across the entire country, under 18, the minimum wage is the equivalent of $10.68 an hour. And that's, if you're 16, that's what you must get paid as a minimum. And we also have a rule here that you can't make up to that minimum wage with tips. Tips are on top of minimum wage. So that is why I missed all of this. Your minimum wage is just too low for you to have these kinds of things, these kind of flexibility that Vance is talking about needing.
Yeah, he wants to keep on shaving corners off this nickel. Like it's amazing what he keeps talking about, as if people don't realize minimum wage is already trash here in the United States.
Yeah.
More about the minimum wage in this next clip.
But people are opposed, like initially knee-jerk reaction to lowering wages and even in lowering minimum wage. I mean, most people feel, and I agree, that minimum wage is almost impossible to live off of, especially with our
100%. Yeah, it is. But what these unions are not asking for, I mean, you have to kind of trust the labor representation of the people to sort of make the right arrangement for them. And so it's not, hey, let's create a minimum wage or a wage floor that's lower than the minimum wage. It's, what about taking for the first year of a person coming into the labor market where, they work an internship for $0 right, at a company, why don't we allow our workers to work effectively in internship, get the training they need, get the benefits that they need, and then join the workforce full time at a much higher wage? The idea is that you trust the union to come up with this stuff, or the labor organization, whatever you want to call it, is you actually give the union the ability to sort of negotiate over this stuff on behalf of its members. You don't assume, the way the United States, we do it is we basically take all that authority away from the union itself, and we try to settle this stuff at the level of the government. But again, where unions have been more successful, where they actually have higher membership and participation rates, what you see is these organizations actually have much greater flexibility. And that ends up meaning that more people want to join. That means these organizations have more power. And then that means they can figure out the arrangement that works best for their membership. So you kind of have to trust people. You have to trust that people are willing to do this thing for their own benefit. And, so long as they've got the right authority and so long as they've got the right tools, you can trust people to do what's in their best interest, and these organizations to do what's in the best interest of their membership.
You know what else we don't have that other countries have? We don't have health care and a social safety net. You can't do that here because your job provides health care. You're not talking, internships don't get it. You're saying don't pay anybody with an internship, but internships normally don't get health insurance. So what are you talking about? You're just supposed to live without any money or health insurance for an entire year?
Yeah, it's ridiculous. I hadn't even put two and two together on the health insurance side of things, because it always astounds me that you guys rely on your job in order for, you rely on your employer for access to your doctor. That is just a ludicrous system. But if you're on an internship where you make no money at all, $0, how do you pay rent? How do you afford food? How do you afford the transport costs to get to the job?
Yeah.
What happens is, the answer to that is, you were already rich. You're from a rich family.
Yes.
Unpaid internships only favor people who were already rich. And so they might do an unpaid internship and then come out at be able to get a higher salary as a result. And that way you just entrench wealth in the people who already had that wealth.
Yep. Yeah, you had to have some sort of safety net that the government does not provide in order to have that particular thing available to you. And at the end, he's just basically hands up. Well, I guess the free market will figure it out. Well, the free market got us here, man. Your extra regulation free market got us here. Next, Joe talks about shareholders.
Well, the problem that people would have with that is that corporations have a responsibility to their shareholders, and they always want to make the most money possible. And they have to make more money next quarter than they made this quarter. And one of the ways they do that is by paying people less.
But that's why I think that you have to give workers some seat at the bargaining table. There is a theory of economics that dominated in the late 20th century America, which is that basically that, the labor market was entirely efficient. And maybe the corporation didn't want to pay their workers more money, but they would be forced to pay their workers more money purely because if they didn't do that, then they wouldn't be able to get enough workers. Now, I do think that there's an argument for, there are all of these ways why we should give workers more bargaining power. One of them, and we've spent a lot of time talking about labor organizations, and that's important. Man, one of the reasons why I'm such an immigration hawk is because it is really important not to flood the country with low-wage immigrants.
Right.
Because if you give a corporation a choice between a low-wage immigrant and a native worker who's going to require, by the way, a native worker of any race, they're going to be forced to pay the native worker more if there's not a pool of low-wage workers to go to. And this is a consistent finding in the economics literature, but also just common sense, that when you flood the country with low-wage immigrants, this is why I think the DSA types are a little full of shit when they talk about helping normal people. If you want to help a normal person, don't provide a corporation 9 low-wage migrants to compete against them when they're bargaining for wages. You actually give workers more power when you have a more restricted immigration policy.
What was he saying about zero-sum thinking earlier? What was he saying?
Yeah,
wow,
exactly.
So it sounds a lot like zero-sum thinking creeped its way back into the conversation here. This is total bullshit. Listen to the language he's using too here. The language is very great replacement theory.
Oh God, it is.
Like all the language he's using is inflamed around immigration when he's talking about this. This is also just bullshit. even people without a college degree who are much more susceptible to a migrant taking their job experienced high employment during the height of the Biden administration when we were supposedly had an open border, according to Joe. Now that has changed since then because our economy has taken a shit since then. But it was at a certain point, they were actually experiencing way higher growth in those sectors specifically. Immigrants also help put way more money into the system. I'll put a link to that debunks this immigrants are taking your job myth in the show notes, but essentially there's about 7 points, but mostly immigrants just give us more money and there's more opportunity because there's more money in the system.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll first of all point out, he's saying that the DSA types are full of shit when they talk about helping normal people because they let so many immigrants in. I'm going to point out an immigrant is also a normal person. Like they're just people, Jesus Christ. But secondly, the answer will be extend your minimum wage to be a living wage so you can actually live on it. It's not just like a legal minimum, but it's actually what you need in order to live. Make sure that can't be kept like augmented by tips, that it's an actual sort of solid living wage. And then extend that living wage to immigrants too. Because the thing is, you're not talking about the labor market being flooded with highly skilled workers in the tech industry who are earning huge figures. You're talking about blue-collar jobs at the lower end of the pay scale. And if you can't pay immigrants less than you pay Americans, you'll completely remove the incentive to favor immigrants if that's what you want to do. But in reality, there's industries where there will always be a lack of willing workers to fill the jobs, like seasonal work on farms. And without immigration, you're in a hole on those. So might be an immigration hawk, but his whole rhetoric around this does not make any sense.
The last clip in our main event, they're talking about phones. This is circling back to the phones that they were talking about earlier, the iPhone, and it sort of leads itself to talk about inflation.
I think a lot of people in this country, if they had to choose, especially people that have money, if they had to choose between a phone that was manufactured in America where people were paid a very good wage and had benefits, and you have an iPhone that has a little American flag on the back, and you have one that doesn't, I think a lot of people would buy the one with the American flag on the back because they would feel better about their purchase. I feel weird when I'm holding a phone and I know that someone was working in some factory in some foreign country, working 15 hours a day.
That's right.
And being paid nothing. That's
right. I think that's true of our food, by the way, too.
Yeah.
They'd much rather it be, made locally. They're willing to pay a little bit more so long as it's healthier and it's made locally. There obviously are exceptions to every rule, but I think that we have run the experiment where we just try to do everything with low-wage foreigners, whether they're in the United States via illegal immigration or whether they're outside the United States via offshoring and outsourcing. And what it has led to is, I think, a society where socialism is a bit on the rise. And one of our jobs in the administration, I think about this all the time, is how do you make things – I'm not saying we're perfect and I'm not saying there isn't a lot of work to do because there is. Like we were left in quite a hole by 40 years of bad policy. People always talk about the Biden administration inflation. Yeah, the Biden administration inflation was terrible, got up to 9%. By the way, I think today's CPI report is you had deflation in the United States. We actually had prices coming down, which is good because the Iran war, gas prices came down. But like
gas prices have come down now because of the Iran war?
No. Compared to where they were a month ago.
Right.
So they're not down from the beginning of the war, but they're down from where they were a month ago. So you had a good CPI report, a consumer price inflation report today.
Can't catch me in a lie.
Yeah, Jesus.
Can I just say really quickly, he says deflation. Deflation is bad. It's not a good thing. Deflation is actually negative in the economy. It's a bad thing to happen to your economy, not some sort of windfall.
Yeah, exactly. And he's talking about gas prices here. Gas prices aren't a good indicator of overall inflation, partly because they're subsidized in some places and partly because they're unusually prone to shock fluctuations. So, gas prices fall, at most they're returning to still higher than they were before the shock of your stupid war in Iran.
Yeah.
And that's what Joe kind of manages to call him on. The balls of him being there to say to Joe that gas prices have gone down and think that he won't get called on that because it's such an obvious bullshit thing to say. it's a bit like shitting your bed and then mopping some of that shit up with a cloth. You can argue there is less shit in the bed, but you can't argue it means you've unshat the bed now. Like, that is still a shitted bed that you're in at this point.
I think the next Democratic slogan needs to be "unshit the bed." I think
Yeah,
that's
exactly.
What it needs to be.
But if you really want to know what's happening, you look at the effective costs on goods that are less volatile than gas. So is your weekly grocery shop more or expensive today than it was a year ago or 5 years ago or 10 years ago? That's the comparator you do. That's the one J.D. Vance doesn't want to do because the answer to that does not look good for his administration.
I just want to say that the Biden inflation comment he makes, that number that he quotes was during the peak of the pandemic.
Oh, of course
it's during the peak of pandemic. So he's quoting something. He's saying, "Oh, it was really bad then," and you're like, "Yeah, but it's bad now too." And it's way worse now when you don't have a worldwide disease going after it. It's just the way what he's doing is he's manipulating the numbers to make it seem like the other guy was way worse, but he's not mentioning all the factors that went into that. And I just want to say the 40 years of bad policy comment. That 40 years, if you roll back the clock, that 40 years starts during Reagan, okay? And then it goes to Bush Sr., also another Republican. 2 terms for Clinton, then 2 terms for Bush, 2 terms for Obama, 1 for Trump, 1 for Biden, and we're back to Trump. So if you count up the Republicans, they outnumber the Democrats, and that's your 40 years of bad policy.
Yeah.
So, if we're going to talk about bad policy, why don't you start blaming the people who literally made this system possible, the Reagan Republicans?
Yeah, and if you also want to add to that a little graph of how the economy was doing at the end of each of those terms,
yes,
you'll find that the direction was going downwards during a lot of those Republican terms.
Absolutely. All right, we're going to move on to our undercard.
And the undercard's banging. The undercard's filled with fights.
So for the undercard this time, we're going to be talking about voter fraud and voter ID. Now, this is something that kind of went viral during this particular episode. Joe says a couple of really appalling things during it, and so we're gonna let him talk. And that starts by talking about that Spencer Pratt election. Now, if you're unfamiliar, Spencer Pratt was a reality star who wound up running for LA mayor, and he was running as a Republican, and he wound up losing in the primaries because if you don't get enough votes to be like 1 or 2, you don't get to. They're not going to put you on the final ballot.
Let me ask you this.
Yeah.
Why is it that large population centers, like places like Los Angeles and New York, are almost always run by the Democrats?
Yeah.
Like, what is it about? First of all, what happened with the last election in Los Angeles, just the primary, I think was
crazy.
So super sus.
Yes,
and here's
is.
why it's super sus. Not just super sus that Spencer Pratt, who was in second place, got overtaken by Nithya Raman in the mail-in ballots, but that the mail-in ballots also passed a tax hike. The people voted to pay more taxes.
Yep.
In a state where you have the highest taxes.
That's right.
They're like, we don't pay enough. That is insane. Then when you have direct evidence that they were recruiting homeless people.
That's right.
And they were getting homeless people and giving them cigarettes and cash. There's evidence of this. To use their address and mail-in ballots.
Yeah, I would be the Californian Joe who wakes up in the morning and says, "You know what? I'm going to go and vote for higher taxes.
I don't
pay enough taxes.
I feel like we could fix this if I just pay 5%
more taxes."
So at the start there, Joe says, what is it about places with large populations that lean towards Democrats? I think the reason these places typically will lean left, it's partly because you're going to be more exposed to different people, different ways of life. It's going to broaden your horizons. It's going to make you a bit less suspicious of people who aren't exactly like you. And that makes you more likely to vote for a left-wing party than a right-wing party. And I think it's also partly because when you're living in a more population-dense area, it's harder to not see issues like wealth inequality or homelessness or deprivation. When you're walking past unhoused people all the time, you're going to recognize that as more of a problem than if you're living in a rural area. Like, I get that where I live. I live in Liverpool now. There are people on the streets who are homeless. Where I grew up in the Northeast, I was in a little village. I'd never seen a homeless person because there were only about 1,000 people live in the village and none of them were homeless. So like the more you are in a population dense area, the more the issues of society are going to be there in front of you. And therefore, the more you're likely to care about those issues, I'd say. And I'd also say it's because right-wing politicians have got a consistently worse track record in managing the economy, because trickle-down economics is a complete myth, and because privatization really only means that someone needs to turn a shareholder profit to do the same job that a publicly owned service would do at cost. So, like, that is kind of it, basically. That is the reason why people, I think, in large population areas are more likely to lean towards the left.
And I want to talk about the taxes here for a second, because he says all these people who sent in their mail-in ballots, the reason why it's sus is that these people, a majority of them voted for higher taxes on themselves. Well, let's take a look at what was on the ballot. They wanted to raise the sales tax, but they did it specifically because they wanted to subsidize all the cuts from the federal government to healthcare. So the administration, this current presidential administration, took away healthcare, and the residents thought it was important enough to actually pay for, so they subsidized it by a 0.5% sales tax in LA. So if they're specifically saying, people aren't getting health care, in order to help other people around us, we're going to subsidize this tiny sales, a very, very small portion of sales tax, a little higher. The other taxes that were on this bill were they wanted to tax unlicensed cannabis businesses more, and they wanted to close tax loopholes around online hotel bookings, because they were getting away with not paying taxes if there was some sort of loophole that you could use for online bookings. And then they voted down a higher tax rate on hotels. So very specifically, none of those things are not like, most of those things, one of them in specific, if you're raising your very small amount of taxes, is because of what this specific administration did. But the other ones are loopholes. And, you know, like, these are just, the regular citizen isn't voting to raise their taxes on purpose for this. They're fixing problems with people cheating, and that includes the federal government cheating regular people out of money they put in that they already had said they would give, and now we've got to subsidize that.
Yeah, and it's amazing as well, like, looking at Joe being so staggered by the idea that people would ever vote to raise their taxes, their local taxes. But I could imagine a bill on the ballot or a proposal on the ballot that would say, if we raise taxes by 0.1%, we can better fund the local schools to make sure that they have access to these kinds of provisions. I'd imagine people would vote for that. So, like, people, when it comes to tax, people like to think of tax as the government has got their hand in your pocket, rather than you're spending your money to make the world around you better, the environment that you're in, the city that you're in better. Like, it is perfectly reasonable that people will choose to pay taxes if they're getting something out of those taxes. But obviously, Joe wouldn't ever look into that. What Joe's actually doing here is endorsing election fraud claims. And I don't think we've heard him do that explicitly before. This feels like the first time he's really ever gone all in on this election was suspect. I think he's normally pretty lukewarm about some stuff, but this seems pretty extreme. So the evidence he talks about, and then we get the hard evidence of people being bribed for filling in ballots and stuff like that. I looked into this. The evidence that they're talking about people being bribed, it came from James O'Keefe. He was the guy who founded and then was kicked out of the far-right group Project Veritas for misappropriating funds. That's why he was misappropriating funds. That's why he got kicked out of Project Veritas. He specialized in doing what he described as undercover stings, but they actually often were highly edited fishing expeditions where he'd try and bait people into saying something that he could cut together on camera to make it look really bad. This isn't actually the first time that Joe has brought up one of James O'Keefe's investigations as evidence on this show, but it is worth, every time he does it, we need to make a note that this is where Joe's getting his information. In this case, that said, it does seem like there was something fishy going on. I looked this up. So Brenda Lee Brown Armstrong, who's 64, she agreed to plead guilty to one felony count of paying a person to register to vote. I'll put the link in the show notes. So Armstrong was a petition circulator. That was a job that she was working as. In that role, she was paid by entities known as coordinators to collect voter signatures on official petitions that qualify initiatives, referendums, recalls for state ballots, stuff like that. So if you want something to be on the ballot, or if you want a proposal to go forward, you need to get enough signatures from amongst the local population to say that this is worthwhile going ahead with. She was one of the people who had to collect those signatures. That was a job she was paid to do. She drove around the LA area to find registered voters to sign these petitions, but she'd only get paid when she gathered enough signatures for the particular ballot. So to make her quota, she was giving unhoused people on Skid Row $3 to sign it, or sometimes giving them a cigarette or a phone charger cable to get them to sign onto this ballot measure. She was arrested for that, and she's actually pled guilty. She also, at the same time, got them to register to vote because they need to be registered voters in order to sign this ballot. Because they were registered to vote, they'd actually receive automatically a mail-in ballot to the address that they'd listed. And that was an address that she'd given them, which was her, like a former address of hers. Because she needed a valid address, they needed to be valid registered voters in order to sign the thing that she needed so she could get paid. That was how this thing worked.
Sure.
Now, to be clear, there is no allegation that any of those mail-in ballots was then completed on their behalf by anybody. So there's no voter fraud here at all. The thing the crime she's been done for was paying people in order to register to vote. That is the genuine crime that was in this video, and I'll put some links in the show notes. I'll now just remind you of 2025 when Elon Musk gave people checks for $1 million in order to vote in Wisconsin's Supreme Court election in March 2025. $1 million is a lot more than a cigarette or a USB cable or $3.
Elon could have got that for a cigarette? Unbelievable.
I know, right?
Well,
it's also way more illegal what he was doing because he wasn't just getting them to sign on so that a ballot could be put to vote. He was getting them to actually register and then vote in the election for a specific thing. Yep. Worse than that, it wasn't just an incentive to vote. Worse, it was arguably an incentive on who to vote for. Because his lawyers argued that the payment was intended to generate a grassroots movement in opposition to activist judges, not to expressly advocate for or against a candidate. But if he says it's to oppose activist judges, and it's pretty clear who he considers to be an activist judge, it's an incentive to vote against that particular person for somebody else. Turns out, last month, that was actually ruled illegal. That was on July 16th. There was a ruling that pointed out on a bipartisan panel that Musk's actions in doing this were illegal. Joe hasn't mentioned it. JD Vance isn't bringing that up. It's important for them to mention this cigarette in order to vote for things to get onto the ballot, but not this thing that Musk, where he was bribing people to a vote.
It's not even the same thing, and he doesn't even realize it. It's amazing.
Yeah, exactly. And bear in mind, all of this about California, about LA and stuff, this is being pushed by the federal government as part of its lawsuit demanding access to California's voter rolls for them to audit. And the judge has actually dismissed that lawsuit earlier in the year. It called the request unprecedented and illegal and said that federal authorities were trying to abridge the right of many Americans to cast their ballots. Disenfranchisement, the thing that JD Vance has said is a bad thing, he is here saying, actually, there's something to it. And the administration he's part of is trying to do that.
This is a continuation. They're still talking about Spencer Pratt in this next clip.
The crazy thing about it, too, is it's that, okay, so after the initial ballots all came in, it was Karen Bass was number one, Spencer Pratt was right behind her, and then number three, whatever this woman's name is, Nithya Raman. Okay, so you would expect the mail-in ballots to be more or less like the original ballots in terms of 1, 2, and 3. I'm not saying Spencer Pratt's going to win the mail-in ballot, but it just so happened that the third place person in relative terms did a lot better than the first and second place person.
Disproportionately better.
Such that the Republican was actually kicked out of the race so that there's not actually a real election in California. That to me was the crazy part. It's like you were designing the vote share in order to kick Pratt out and put the third person into second place. That to me is like very, very bizarre. Because what is the theory of the mail-in vote that is somehow like so much more pro-Nithya relative to Karen Bass?
Makes no sense.
Makes no sense.
Makes no sense. Why would it be? Yeah. Why would it be? I mean, Karen Bass was ahead by every metric.
okay, so this is a really easy thing to figure out if you just think about it just for a second. Progressives very much vote by mail. Very often, it's the biggest group of people who are going to vote by mail. If that option is available in your area, it's going to be progressives. The more progressive candidate in this particular case, they got more votes by mail. That's just Occam's razor.
Yeah, and Joe and JD Vance here are saying that they don't understand it. Makes no sense, makes no sense, makes no sense, makes no sense. JD Vance must know what this is. This is very well established, and JD Vance has been around politics long enough to know that this happens. I'd say even Joe would know this. I think we've heard them talk about kind of the wave that comes with mail-in ballots. So it feels like either Joe has forgotten this or they are agreeing to make it seem like this is strange when it actually isn't. And I think really what's happening here is that this is motivated reasoning because Joe really wanted Spencer Pratt to win. He had Spencer Pratt on the show. We almost covered it, but then when he lost, it wasn't worth us covering. He's talked about him on several other shows as well. And Spencer Pratt's chances of winning were hugely overestimated because of the company he was keeping. Rogan saw him as the frontrunner. He never was. Rogan saw him that way because he's in a bubble, and the people around Rogan and leeching off that Rogan bubble, they felt the same way, or at least pretended to feel the same way to continue being in that bubble. That possibly even included Pratt, who was in that bubble. Maybe it included Vance, or maybe Vance was just willing to play one of those people on TV in order to whip up Republican voters' fears of electoral fraud 3 months before the midterms, or a few months before the midterms. In reality, California just didn't vote for the candidate who was a reality TV star whose only qualifications were endorsements from right-wing podcast bros and Elon Musk. And Elon Musk has been now amplifying this stolen election misinformation.
Yeah.
And
there was no chance the guy was going to win. Like, what are you talking about? It's such a silly thing to even think.
Yeah, exactly. And this is just a really small detail, but Pratt was also criticized because he filmed a campaign ad outside of Nithya Raman's home address. And I only mention that because it wasn't that long ago that Joe was completely livid when Mamdani filmed on the street outside of a skyscraper that someone just happens to live at the very, very top of.
Okay, this next clip's about mail-in ballots.
Like, I'm not saying we're going to win California in my lifetime necessarily, but I don't like the idea of giving up on it.
Well, it's not just giving up on. I mean, giving up on it would be terrible. It's an awesome state. The real problem is it's deeply corrupt. Yes. I mean, deeply, deeply corrupt. And what they're trying to do is make it impossible for the other side to win.
Yeah.
And there should be laws against that. First of all, the idea of mail-in ballots for anybody other than people who are invalids, who can't leave their homes, or military, or people that are, for some reason they're serving overseas, they're doing something overseas. It should not be legal.
That's right.
And the fact that it became ubiquitous during COVID is a giant problem.
Yeah, so this raises one of my total segue here, side point. But so if you remember in the aftermath of the 2020 election, where there was all this like debate about was the election stolen, was the election not stolen, all the litigation that moved through, there was a case in Pennsylvania that like didn't get very much attention. And I'm going to butcher it a little bit, but basically it was a guy in a rural area of Pennsylvania saying, you're undercounting my vote because we didn't have the opportunity to do the mail-in ballots like they did in Philadelphia and Pittsburgh. And like the argument was a kind of disparate impact, right? The cities ginned up all the mail-in balloting and the ballot harvesting. You didn't do that in the country, and that hurt sort of our representation. So they take this case to the Pennsylvania courts. And what's crazy is the Pennsylvania courts basically say, you're making kind of a good point here. Like the ballot harvesting did affect Republicans in a more negative way. It did mean that certain people in the more rural parts of the state were underrepresented. But then the court conclusion was this is not a problem a court can fix. Like that's a political problem. Change your, local elections leaders, change your laws. Like that's not a remedy that the court has to fix. And so everybody saw that case and they're like, oh, the judge rules against Donald Trump, rules against Republicans for saying that there was something illegitimate. But no, actually, the judge kind of said there is something kind of fishy here. We're just the wrong venue to fix it.
So the thing is, J.D. Vance subtly said, if you remember all the debate over whether the election was stolen or not, there was no debate over whether it was stolen. There were lies, there were election denials, but there was no actual debate. And that's why there were all those cases got thrown out. This is part of the project of trying to rerun that whole thing, rewrite history as there being some question over that election. And there obviously clearly wasn't. Also notice that Joe is now talking about how obviously deeply corrupt California is. He's just accepted at face value that that's true. And again, this is how the history or the present gets rewritten, how these ideas get embedded in the canon from being initially raised. Now it's just an accepted fact of the Joe Rogan universe that California is deeply, deeply corrupt. And we will continue to just reference that in future as if it's been established when it has not been established. What if Joe really strongly feels that there should be laws against, for example, say, trying to ensure that the other side can't win an election? I can't wait for him to find out about gerrymandering. I think it's going to blow his tiny mind when he finds out that gerrymandering is a real thing.
Right.
He's against the idea of mail-in ballots for anyone other than invalids or the military. But the thing is, mail-in ballots just help people who can't, for example, take time off work to go stand in a voting line, especially in communities where they have deliberately limited how many different voting lines there are because there aren't many polling stations, and that's a deliberate attempt to disenfranchise people. So you can send in a mail-in ballot in order to avoid that. And in other conversations, he has shown that he is genuinely capable in moments of understanding how hard it can be to be working in a regular job and just trying to make ends meet. So the fact that he can't consider those factors in here, it might not be deliberate, but it does show how his sympathy for the working guy can just be completely short-circuited if you push the right buttons. And Vance knows where all of Joe's special buttons are.
Yeah, that's a great point. J.D. Vance mentions a court case in this, and as near as I can tell, I tried to search for a bunch of these court cases to try to figure out what exactly he's talking about. As near as I can tell, there isn't a court case in Pennsylvania like what he's describing, or he's just grossly distorting the case where someone was actually arguing about the mail-in ballots coming in after Election Day. So there was a case about that, but it was about how they were coming in after Election Day and then they were being counted. Well, that's just how mail works. You can, when you do a mail-in ballot, if it is postmarked by Election Day, it's a valid ballot because they voted before Election Day. That's how time works. That's how sequential works. So they just what they're doing is they're trying to argue that that's an invalid vote because it hurt their chances. And if they could invalidate that vote, then they would allow Trump to win Pennsylvania. Well, that didn't happen because that's how the system was set up. That's how their laws were set up. So I'm happy to be corrected on this if someone knows of a case that he's discussing where somehow there wasn't mail-in ballots available in the rural areas, but that's not according to even, I found a ruling where the ACLU was celebrating a specific court by a ruling by mail, a ruling on a vote by mail thing. And I looked up the laws, and the laws in Pennsylvania specifically say all people in Pennsylvania are allowed to vote by mail based on the law that they passed. So none of that stuff he's saying is true, or it's grossly distorted.
Yeah, exactly. But even if what he's saying is true, he's saying that mail-in ballots were unfair because some people had access and not others. His argument then would have to be that mail-in ballots are a good thing, but you've got to limit them. Otherwise, people have too easy an access to their rights compared to other people. Rather than saying that everybody should have the same opportunity. So therefore, if it's a good way to make sure that people can vote, you widen access. It's pretty clearly just a partisan motivated reasoning here. And ultimately, he's talking about Pennsylvania because it's a crucial swing state generally, and they have focused a huge amount of their efforts on sowing doubts about the security of the result there in the past and therefore in the future.
This next clip went viral. This is talking about stolen elections.
Well, it's just very disheartening that you have to consider the fact that it's really possible that the elections get stolen. And the California one was a big one for me.
And why not just have mail-in, or why not just have voter ID?
Yeah.
That's
insane. Not only did they not have voter ID, you can't show your ID. You're not allowed to show your ID.
You can in fact be prosecuted if you try to force somebody to show their ID.
Seems like you want people to cheat.
Exactly.
And this is from the same people that were saying you have to have an ID that shows you've been vaccinated just 4 years ago.
To
To go to
grocery
restaurant.
shopping or to go to a restaurant. Yeah, no, it's definitely, that's the part about it that I think makes most people of my political persuasion skeptical of what the Democrats are doing.
Yeah.
Like, if you don't want to cheat in the election, then just make everybody actually show an ID. Another thing people don't realize is, I didn't realize this until a couple years ago, the voter ID solves a lot of the mail-in ballot problem. Because if you have to show an ID in order to get a mail-in ballot, in order to actually, confirm that there's a real identification attached to that vote, that solves a big chunk of the problem too.
This is just logical.
Yes.
Like, I'm not
Every country
skeptical.
does it.
I'm not skeptical. I'm accusing them. I think they stole the election.
Yes.
And
Yes.
I think it's common.
What a brazen and uninformed comment. He is just so blatantly uninformed, and he has no idea how voting works. And it's so appalling, and this got so much play.
Yeah, exactly. And Joe here is completely uninformed. Like, Vance is laughing along and agreeing this is all bullshit because he knows full well all of the arguments about all of this, but he knows that they want to bring in voter ID because he's going to use it as voter suppression. That is their deliberate thing. I will point out as well here, Joe, he says that California was the big one for me. When it comes to stolen elections, election fraud, California was the big one. He's been softened up in particular. Before this, he was softened up. But now this experience with Spencer Pratt, the guy he really wanted to win the election, not winning the election, I think this is now a pivotal point for Joe. And now he's even saying they stole the election and it's common. So now he is at risk of being a total election denier in the future in a way that I don't think he was previously.
Yeah.
And I think we've seen this multiple times with Joe, where a personal experience is, especially with somebody he knows, is enough to completely shear him off and then send him down a radical path. And I think that's happened right here with this this election. And then when it comes to when they're talking about voter ID, it specifically obviously becomes a question of what counts as an acceptable piece of ID for voting. We have that issue here in the UK. We introduced voter ID for the last election that we have. It was the Tories who introduced it. And under the Tory government's proposals, under how they ran voter ID, a pensioner's travel pass counted as acceptable ID for voting purposes. A young person's travel pass didn't. That is pretty clear how easy it can be to gerrymander at that point. That is why the voter ID is such an issue.
Yeah, and people don't understand the why they're trying to do this. One of the big reasons why you shouldn't have voter ID is voting is a right. ID is not free. You have to pay money for it. If I say you need an ID for it, that's a poll tax.
Yeah.
Time is not free. I don't have time. If I don't have time to get your proper, very specific ID, I can't actually do it. And now they're suggesting that you need citizenship proof in the United States, which means you might need a passport. That's over $100 in order to get that. That's a poll tax. What you're doing is creating a poll tax. Now, you could say, well, we'll also accept birth certificates, but some people don't have their original birth certificate, and they might need to, again, take time out to go to the county where they were born in order to get a duplicate. They have to pay money for that. That's a poll tax.
And
nobody's offering to do any of this for free
either. It's not going to work as birth certificates aren't photo ID,
it's
quite
not
famously,
a photo ID.
so it's not going to be useful for that.
Yeah, you'll have to still produce a photo ID and your birth certificate if this is the thing that they want to get passed. So these are just more and more obstacles for a right that we have.
Yeah, exactly that. And look, if their argument is voter ID is essential, therefore we're going to make the ID free and we'll make it mandatory that you're going to be given the paid time off work in order to get the ID, and then we make it mandatory that you get the paid time off work in order to vote, we might believe them that this is about election integrity.
Yeah.
But until there's all those other bits to it, this isn't about integrity in the slightest.
It's shocking to me because no one ever calls Joe on this, or nobody in his orbit or on his program. Obviously, he's interviewing people that already agree with voter ID when he talks to people about this. But it's so shocking that nobody has stopped him and said, you do realize there's other ways to identify someone other than just showing them your ID, right? When I go to vote, I don't have voter ID in my state. Now, there's about, I think there's something like, I think 20 states or something that don't require a photo ID in order to vote. But they identify me in multiple ways. I have to know my name. I have to know my date of birth. I have to know where I live. And I have to sign a piece of paper that they then look at and make sure it matches my signature.
Yeah.
Now, it's possible that I could feasibly memorize those things of someone else and maybe even practice their signature enough to do it. But the problem is that it basically winds up being a nothing because I can't really use that in order to really fraudulently affect an election. That's not something that's possible. And there's many ways that we are able to identify other people other than a photo ID. When you lose your password, when you're looking for something online, they don't say, hey, we need to make sure this is you. Can you send me your photo ID to make sure it's you? No, I tell you the name of my dog when I was a kid. And that then, because that's a way to identify people. We can do this with ways other than photos. And Joe just what he wants to say is he just wants an easy answer to say that the people he likes are right. Okay, so talk about the amount of election fraud in this next clip.
And this idea that elections can't be stolen, I always say to people, okay, do you think that the amount of election fraud is 0%? No one thinks that.
Yeah.
No one thinks it's zero.
Exactly.
There's always some overzealous person that works somewhere that's doing something. There's always crazy people that like blue no matter who, we got to win, or red no matter what. There's always people, right and left, that are going to try to rig the election because they think it's imperative. Look, we saw there was people like Oprah Winfrey was saying it. Like, if we don't win this election, you may never vote again. Like, what the fuck are you talking about? Like, why? Who's going to tolerate that? Left or right? That's crazy.
That's right.
But that attitude allows people to justify cheating.
Correct.
And I think they cheat. And I think they've been doing it forever. And I don't think there's any other reason why you would have no voter ID.
Listen to this straw man that he starts out with. Nobody is claiming that elections are perfect, right? What we're saying is that the amount of election fraud that happens in every single election essentially amounts to a rounding error that never materially changes the election whatsoever in any kind of practical terms.
Yeah, that's exactly it. We know that election fraud does happen. There were even cases last time around where people, for example, tried to vote on behalf of people in their life who died, or people who cast a vote, but they weren't eligible to vote because they've been a prisoner or they have been incarcerated in the past, those type of thing. And it does happen, just like there are people who still claim Social Security for people who died. It happens, but it's a drop in the ocean, and it's never been enough to significant enough to sway a single election. I was actually trying to find what elections had the closest majority what states had the closest majority in the U.S. in the last election, but it's in the margin of thousands and thousands and thousands. You would need multiple people doing this at scale before you even shifted the needle a tiny, tiny amount. However, by making election fraud the center of their political project, Vance and Trump are trying to introduce the kind of integrity checks that would stamp out those few votes that are actually fraudulent, but also stamp out a few 100,000 legitimate votes as well. And they would be choosing whose votes count at that point.
Exactly. All right, more on voter ID.
And they try to say, oh, it's racist to have voter ID. Like, what are you talking about? Do you think other races are incapable of going to the DMV? That's insane.
Yeah, that's racist. It's actually super racist.
That's really racist.
Right, the implication of their argument is literally like blacks and Hispanics cannot go to the DMV to get an ID. By the way, if you look at the polling, Black Americans are as pro-voter ID. Even though most Black Americans vote Democrat, they're still pro-voter ID as much as white Americans is.
Most Americans are voter. So they want voter ID, except for operatives.
So I'll offer on the Joe Rogan podcast this deal as vice president of these United States, that if Democrats really don't think that there's any cheating, give us voter ID.
I just don't know
give
how
us voter
it's
ID,
not.
And we'll stop talking so much about
Why is that not
elections.
A federal thing?
We are trying to make it a federal thing. So we are right now trying to pass the Save America Act. One of its main provisions is a requirement that you do voter ID. And we actually have, I think, a majority of the Senate that would support it. But this is just weird Senate procedural bullshit. There is a subsegment of people who want voter ID, but won't blow up the filibuster in order to achieve it.
So again, he knows these arguments. This is not an honest, I would argue, not an honest appraisal of the situation here. The arguments against voter ID aren't that black and Hispanic people won't get ID or can't get an ID. It's that people who are like either on the breadline or who are like working around the breadline, who are impoverished, they can't afford the time or the money to go off and get an ID. And because of the way that America is, those people are statistically more likely to be black, Hispanic, people of color, etc. It isn't that voter ID is racist. It's that poverty has a racial bias. And in America, if there was an America where that wasn't true, voter ID wouldn't be criticized as racist. If like poverty affected everybody equally and wealth affected everybody equally, it wouldn't be racist at that point. But the world that we live in, it is. And I'm sure there are plenty of people from those backgrounds who are behind the push for voter ID. And that is in part because they've been repeatedly sold the lie that the election was stolen, that election fraud is a major issue, sold the lie by podcasts like this and by politicians like Vance. So what Vance is saying here is, we should be allowed to do our voter suppression because we've worked really hard at our campaign of propaganda to make sure that people think we should be allowed to do this. And his offer, as much as he presents this as a gotcha, is completely ridiculous. His offer is, if you think we are making up this threat, why not just give us exactly what we want? The point is, if what you want is anti-democratic, your stated reasons for wanting it are false here. Like, he might as well be saying, well, if you don't really think there are monsters under your bed, why wouldn't you give us the power to just barge into every bedroom in America whenever you want? Well, we won't give you that power because there are no monsters under the bed.
All right, last clip in our undercard. This is them talking about immigration.
I think it's also a narrative change. And the narrative is stopping immigration is cruelty.
Correct.
And you're racist or xenophobic, and that we should just instead give these people citizenship. And it's not a coincidence that, I mean, like, what we dealt with over the last 4 years was insane, where they just opened the border and not just encouraged people to come across, but facilitated it.
Correct.
Helped them, got them on Medicaid, got them on Social Security, got people, they told people, do you have a bad back? Okay, well, you're permanent disability and you get free money.
Yeah.
Put them in a hotel, give them a phone. Like, that's crazy.
Yep.
And then move them to blue states.
Yep.
And then you realize that has a direct impact on congressional seats.
Mm-hmm.
Because of the census,
Exactly.
which is also nuts. The
Which is
census
totally
should
nuts.
count citizens.
It should only count citizens, but it doesn't. And that actually steals congressional representation away from areas that have lower illegal immigration.
Right.
Which is its own problem.
So let's, while we end this show, and they were ending their show, let's detour quickly so we can bring on the Great Replacement Theory, right?
Yeah.
That's essentially what this is. This is a condensed version of the Great Replacement Theory that they're mentioning on the show. None of these things that he's saying are true. There was no open border. There weren't benefits for undocumented people. There's no census manipulation as near as we can tell. And there's no congressional seats because of manipulation that are happening. That's just where people live based on where the jobs are. So all of those things, none of those things are true. But of course, they're going to try to hit every single high point they can of the Great Replacement Theory to finish out this conversation.
Yeah, exactly. They know the episode's nearly over, so Joe is forcing in a reference to his pet paranoia. And I think he believes all of these things. I think he genuinely, I don't think he's bringing these things up cynically. I think he's bringing them up towards the end of the show because he wanted to make sure that he fit them in and talked about them. But this just shows the power of repetition in building a canon on Joe's show. For all the little times when other people have been on to make these points about open borders and to make these points about congressional seats, all of those are now cemented into the canon just as much as California is 100% corrupt. All these things are just cemented as truths now for Joe Rogan. And as a result, he's quite happy to back these anti-democratic measures because the ground that he's working from has all these established false facts in it that make this anti-democratic measure the obvious choice of what to do next. And that's been part of the political project of keeping Joe on side.
Let's wrap it up with that. Thank you, sir. Appreciate you very much. You're a beautiful person.
All right, Marsh, here we are. End of the show. Anything good in this?
Yeah, I'll leave you to go first because I think we're going to have exactly the same good point here. And it is a genuine good point, but I'll give you a chance to talk about it first.
Yeah, so Joe winds up having a conversation in this episode. It's a maybe 10 or 15 minute conversation about why the 10 Commandments in a class is bad. And we shouldn't have the 10 Commandments, and we shouldn't have a state-sponsored religion. And we shouldn't be showing these things to kids. And he pushes back and articulates a very good, if not regurgitated, position from an argument, and that is basically James Tallarico's argument. So it's very specifically, he had him on the show, and it's something that he remembers. Now it's met by Vance, who lies a bunch about a bunch of laws, and then but Joe actually does an okay job of trying to get his point across. And I think Vance actually looks like a bit of a buffoon here.
Yeah, I completely agree. And it's sort of like the light side of what I was just talking about in terms of like embedding things in the canon of truths of Joel's show, because James Tallarico came on this show and explained what's wrong with the 10 Commandments. And he did that in a way that, as you say, like was very understandable to Joe. And now Joe is able to, there's parts of this conversation where Joe brings up the idea that there are Christian nationalists who are deliberately using the 10 Commandments to push Christian nationalism. And he's able to push back against that, to recognize Christian nationalism is wrong, that it's got no place in what America was meant to be, what America was meant to be. And it shows that when Joe is spoon-fed the reasons by someone with a soothing enough voice that they can do the, here comes the aeroplane, well enough with so that Joe opens up, he'll accept these arguments and then be able to articulate them back. What he can't do, and what he shows in this, is he can't fully understand them and appreciate them. So he can talk about Christian nationalists, but what he can't do from there is recognize he sat across the table from one of those Christian nationalists, or at the very least, someone who is willing to play one on television because it's good for them. So Joe can repeat the arguments, but he can't understand them enough to recognize them when they're otherwise right in front of him.
Yeah, J.D. Vance, the guy who's praising a guy during this episode who helped write Project 2025, right?
Exactly.
Who was an influence on Project 2025. That's the guy who you're sitting across from, and you can't put two and two together. Another, I think, important piece of why it embedded in Joe's brain is the conspiracy piece, because Joe in this episode keeps coming back to it's being funded by these right-wing billionaires who are trying to change how we're doing things in America. And that is something, that's like this little sticky hand, those little sticky grabber hands. If you can somehow get conspiracy on there, it will embed itself in Joe's brain. Yeah. So I think that's the way to do it, is to somehow hint that there's a conspiracy, and Joe will remember it. It's like a mnemonic device. He'll remember it immediately if you do it that way. Okay, that's it for our show this week. Remember that you can access more than a half hour bonus content every single week for as little as $1 an episode by subscribing at patreon.com/NoRogan. Meanwhile, you can hear more from me, Cognitive Dissonance, Citation Needed. You can hear more from Marsh, Skeptics with a K, and the Skeptic podcast. And we're going to be back next week for a little more The No Rogan Experience. If you love the show, please rate and share it. If you want to get in touch with us, become a patron, or check out the show notes, go to norogan.com, KNOWROGAN.com.